Hi, and welcome to China's First Empires. We're going to look at the history of classical era China. We're going to go a little bit before then and touch just briefly afterwards and hit some of the high points of arguably one of the most successful civilizations to ever exist in human history. We're going to start off with terms, of course. We're going to start off with Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven is a Confucian belief, which is a little on the circular and kind of self-fulfilling side. It's a reading into history of Chinese history that the heavens, or the sense of overarching order, rewards or punishes China, particularly China's leaders, based upon their competence to rule. If you have a competent leader, everything runs smoothly. The heavens withhold lightning, and they withhold the hailstorms, and they withhold famines and barbarian invasions. However, if you are not a good leader, if you are incompetent, if you are immoral, then obviously the heavens will punish you by punishing your kingdom, causing upheavals and the ending of your dynasty. This brings us to Dynastic Cycle. The Dynastic Cycle, which I'll get into a little bit more, is a pattern of the rise, rule, and collapse of all long-lasting dynasties in China. Now, both the Mandate of Heaven and the Dynastic Cycle are much neater explanations of how human history works than is the reality. But in the case of China, they do fit fairly well, and you can see recurring themes happening time and time again. The difference is, of course, the Dynastic Cycle is a little bit more easy to pin down. It's less judgmental. The Mandate of Heaven is a Confucian belief, which again goes back to rewrite history way in the past and says, see, these people didn't last because they didn't follow our modern Confucius beliefs, for instance. And then finally, Silk Road. It's a series of trade routes, both land-based and ocean-going, that connects China with the rest of Eurasia, including India, the Middle East, and of course, Europe. Most of the trade along this route favors China, which allows it to become extremely successful. One of the reasons that it's favored is because of the amount of products that it's able to produce, some especially exotic products, things like silk, after which the road was named. Now, it wasn't known as the Silk Road during the majority of its time in existence, and in fact, that's actually an 18th century German appellation. It does seem to fit, however, and we have to make sure that we understand that the Silk Road, quote-unquote Silk Road, is actually a series of trade routes, and that it's not one big highway going east-west. That would have been a massive undertaking. It would have been really awesome. The reality was it was a bunch of different paths that both went on the ocean and went overland. We will be studying imperial Roman history, but in general, this is what the imperial structure looked like. If you have the Roman laws and the Roman customs and even the Roman language are kind of the matrix into which you have inserted different cultures, much like you would with bits of fruit inside of a Jello mold. Okay, so you would have the Germanics, the Italians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Celts, the Sicilians, and all these different people that are all functioning within this imperial structure. It doesn't really have any relationship to these different societies, but it does provide an overarching, solidifying structure. Comparatively, Chinese imperial structure has a lot in common with the societies that it rules. In fact, the so-called Chinese, and I put it in quotation marks for a reason, which we'll get to in a little bit, the Chinese cultural similarity is much like the Greek cultural similarity or the Celtic cultural similarity. They have shared belief systems, shared language, art, philosophy, and traditions, but they tended to have different leaders, different factions, kind of city-states, small kingdoms, and eventually, of course, confederacies rise up. Eventually, with the beginning of the Qin dynasty, which we'll head to in just one moment here, we get this imperial structure that is mirrors a lot of the norms that are prevalent in these different cultural pockets of Chinese identity. So why the difference? Why is China so successful? Well, first, the rivers of China allow for relatively easy access to the interior. Geographical elements play a huge part, especially in the success of China. These rich rivers allow for relatively consistent and bountiful produce, which means to provide for a large amount of people, which means there's going to be large kingdoms, which means there's going to be more products, and that means there's going to be more likelihood of an empire or some kind of overarching government turning all of these different cogs into a well-oiled political, social, and economic machine. Linguistically, the Chinese languages do diverge into dialects, and in the modern sense, the different dialects like Cantonese, Wu, Mandarin, and so on and so forth, they are mutually unintelligible when spoken. However, the First Empire unifies the written language, and that written language maintains its legacy for about 2,500 years. To the point where somebody who speaks Mandarin can read the Chinese language and communicate effectively with somebody who speaks only Cantonese or who speaks Gan or whatever. So it unifies the disparate cultures in a way that is very profound and very long-lasting. And of course, nothing breeds success like success. If you are a winning team, people want to join you, or at the very least want to emulate you. So the growing population breeds wealth. Wealth breeds a growing population. Growing population breeds more wealth. And of course, we have, when we finally get to it during the Confucian period, this philosophical emphasis that almost becomes part of the Chinese identity of Confucian emphasis on stability and order. And of course, even outside of Confucius, if we talk about Taoism or legalism or even Buddhism as it is later introduced into China, there's this emphasis on stability and order. So there's a cultural gravitation towards a natural order or towards a harmonious civilization. And in fact, many of these dynasties that arise out of chaotic periods offer that kind of stability, and many people flock to them, making them more successful. The important major rivers have a profound effect on China. The two big ones that we're going to talk about are the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. Now, a lot of people think of China as a kind of homogeneous, one-size-fits-all society. But as we look at the different rivers, we'll see how actually those societies are far more different than we would initially notice on first inspection. The Yellow River in the north is a very rich, mud-rich river, hence its name. It's got this yellow clayish mud that brings a lot of nutrients and makes the growing of cereal crops very easy. In particular, the growth of millet, which is an ancient grain. It's usually it's found in birdseed now, but it's actually a very nutritious grain, very easy to grow. It prefers more arid environments, sort of Midwestern United States kind of environments. And the Yellow River offers that kind of environment. It's relatively dry, it's relatively flat, very fertile soil. Now, the Yellow River is a bit problematic. It is much like the Tigris and Euphrates in that it is very sporadic in what causes it to flood. Because it's flowing through such varied terrain, it has an uneven or unequal flood and withdrawal cycle, leading it to be called the Scourge of China. Another reason it's sometimes referred to as the Scourge of China is because during the Warring States period, some warlords would dam up the river upstream, cutting off water from those downstream, and then would release it as a flood. It would become this kind of weapon, which would destroy countryside, the productive capability of others living further down the river. So it was also kind of unfairly burdened with the appellation of Scourge of China. By contrast, the Yangtze flows through mountainous terrains with large areas of flooded wetlands. These flooded wetlands slow the river down. Also, they act as natural breaks to floods, so that when it rains heavily in the mountains, those wetlands absorb and slow down the river's flow, so that when it floods, it's not quite so bad, and so it's a much more stable environment. And because it's a wetter climate, millet doesn't grow, and instead we have rice that is growing. How successful is this area? Well, there is evidence that there were settlements that date back all the way back to 2700 BCE. Now, that's not to say that they were agricultural settlements. No, not at all. But they are one of the early cradles of human habitation. And it's not until we get to the Middle East and we get to Egypt that we start getting agriculture beginning to take root. And then as the technology becomes more prevalent and maybe it follows trade routes or maybe it's independently discovered, then you start getting some cultivation, particularly of rice. Rice is a very difficult product to cultivate. It needs certain super wet conditions, in fact almost drowned conditions that would ruin other crops for part of its life. Then it needs to be taken to relatively drier conditions for part of its life, and then wet again. So it's a very persnickety cereal grain, but it does allow for quite a bit of food to be produced. And unlike the Yellow River, the Yangtze is relatively deep. It doesn't have a lot of sedimentary backup, so deep-hulled vessels, particularly trade vessels, are able to go up and down it relatively easily. And this facilitates movement and control of the area. I want to stop and talk about culture a little bit. And we usually associate the idea of silk with China. In fact, the Silk Road was named the Silk Road because of the majority of trade coming from China. And in the 18th century, the Germans recognized how much silk was being consumed by the Europeans. So silk is a phenomenal fabric, and it's unlike any other fabric that we're going to find elsewhere in the world. The threads themselves are made from the silkworm cocoon, and it creates a shimmering fabric that has a very smooth texture. Now, the way that the silk is processed is that the threads, the cocoons, must be boiled to make the threads come apart. There's a protein that holds the threads together, and by boiling it, you break down those proteins, and the threads are able to become unraveled, and then you can weave it into a cloth. Now, legend holds it that an empress discovered this property of a silkworm cocoon when drinking her tea. She was sitting underneath a mulberry tree. She was drinking her tea, and a cocoon fell in, and it began to unravel. And of course, the iron stomach, very hard to upset empress, orders that a garment be made from the cocoons of these silkworms. Well, this may be a easy and convenient legend to discuss how silk was eventually brought into production. Of course, it has the sanction of an empress, so therefore it must be a very special garment, and only she had it for a long time, so everybody wanted to emulate her, that sort of thing. But the problem, it starts to break down. First, the earliest known production of silk is around 3000 BCE, shortly after the settlement in China of agricultural societies. There were no empresses in 3000 BCE, at least not from we can find. The closest we come to is the Xia, Xia, the Xia dynasty, but that is largely believed to be a mythological dynasty that is created much, much later during the classical period to explain why certain things happen and how to set precedents. It also provides a small pantheon of minor gods and demigods, much in the same way that the Greeks provide you with Hercules and Perseus and Orion and these different heroes. So what we do know, however, is that the status of silk began as a kind of royal fabric and later becomes an imperial fabric. But by the time we get to about 300 BCE, silk is relatively common in China, with bureaucrats and merchants wearing it at least on special occasions. Another aspect of the culture is the mythology and religion of traditional Chinese society. Much like many of the other societies that we will study prior to the advent of monotheism, the Chinese religion remains all the way into the modern period a polytheistic society. There's a multiplicity of gods. There's also some demons running around, and in general, gods represent order and demons represent chaos. That's not to say good and evil. There's slightly different variation on that. To the Chinese, there are such things as necessary evils or undeserved goods, that sort of thing. So good and evil are a little bit more squidgy of a concept, but order and chaos are much more firmly embedded in Chinese ideology. Now, setting aside from this is the dragon, and I'll get to who the dragon is in a little bit. Whereas in European society, dragons represent one thing, they represent something else in Chinese society. So we have polytheism mixed with animism, this belief that all objects have some kind of energy or some kind of spirit that guides them. One of the ways that we know this is through so-called bone writing. The way that the Chinese used to tell fortunes was they would take animal bones, you would inscribe a question upon the animal bone, and then you would throw the animal bone into a fire, and then the sage would read the bone after it cracks, and the way that it cracks would give you an answer. And of course the sage was the only one who knew that, so it was kind of a fortune-telling thing. And then finally, we have ancestral worship, and this remains an important part even today. And although we like to scoff at the idea of ancestor worship, and we think of it as worshiping like a false god or something like that, it has a different connotation within Chinese and in fact most Asian societies. It is a veneration of the ancestor. It is being pious and loving towards ancestors that are well and truly dead, perhaps for generations or even hundreds of years. And let's cut them a little slack. We do that even today in the United States, in any Christian kingdom or any Christian state you go to, you will find cemeteries. Cemeteries are there not for the dead, because the dead are dead. They don't care. They don't care what's on them. They don't care if it's a nice basalt tombstone, or if it's a granite one, or if it's one made of concrete or one made out of wood. It's there for the living. And the living go there and they talk to the past, and they say, "Grandma, I wish you were still here," or "I know Uncle Steve is looking down on me from above and guiding my steps," or maybe my mom is praying for me in heaven. We do that. So we need to cut the Chinese a little bit of slack, because ancestors that come before us connect us to the past. And in China, connection to the past is incredibly important. In the United States, they see as a nation of collective amnesiacs, that we don't know our past. We don't know our ancestry as well as they do. We don't know our lineages as well as they do. We don't know our connections to the society as well as they do. So the dragon in China is a protector and guider of human activity, essentially bringing wisdom and enlightenment and protection to human beings. The imperial dragon, pictured here, is often seen as a force of nature that is a harsh judge, much like a parochial father would be, but also a protector, much as a good father would be. Not saying that humans are descended from dragons, but the dragon exists outside of the pantheon. He's not worshipped as a god, but he is revered as, or it is revered as, the kind of source of wisdom and the source of divine guidance. Before we get to the empire, we have to set the stage. Now, before the empire, there was something called the Zhao Confederacy, sometimes erroneously referred to as the Zhao Empire. And the Zhao, from what we can piece together, is a leading kingdom in a confederacy of a bunch of different provinces, and that the Zhao led by force of arms, by being the strongest, for instance, of the kingdoms in northern modern-day China. And they were located along the Yellow River, that northern river that we mentioned. They emerge about 1300 BCE and begin to dominate or cajole or perhaps lead their neighbors. The Zhao Confederacy, however, doesn't last into the written historical period. The historical period actually picks up sometime after that. And it devolves into a warring faction period by about the 5th century. I have the 3rd century here, BCE. Actually, by the 5th century BCE, which leads to what's called the Warring States period. Now, that's not to say that they were constantly at war, but they were at war often enough that it leads to relative instability within China. And when a dynamic, go-getter, wannabe emperor does emerge and begin to conquer everything, it's almost a relief and almost a sense of order being imposed, even though his order can be rather harsh and draconic. The Zhao were further weakened by nomadic raiders from the northern areas, particularly Mongols, Turks, and Manchus. These raiders often were opportunistic, taking the time to trade with the strong dynasties, but if the dynasties became weak, they preyed upon them. They raided them and stole treasure and people and territory from them. So this is what the Warring States period looks like. We have a bunch of different kingdoms, the Yan, the Zhao, the Qi, the Wei, the Qin, the Han, and the Chu. These warring periods, about 3rd century BCE, would finally come to a head and be united under a single kingdom or a single empire. And that emperor is Qin Shi Huangdi. One of the reasons why when I mentioned the Xia earlier, Xia, Xia, as being somewhat mythological from where all these fantastic rulers come from, is because the Qin dynasty, for the longest period of time, was believed also to be a mythological dynasty, that it was invented by a dynasty called the Han dynasty, which we'll get to at the end of the lecture. It was invented by the Han dynasty as a kind of excuse for why they were in power. However, in the 1970s, all of that was turned on its head as young men who were digging a well in a remote portion of China discovered an incredible find. It was a terracotta head. Looked like a warrior, and they were just absolutely stunned to see this pit filling up, and it had water in it, and then there's this head floating in it. So they turn it over to the Chinese government. The Chinese government begins an extensive excavation project, and they find, well, I'll show you what they find later on. Qin Shi Huangdi, in legend, was referred to as the Tiger of China, and often in drawings of mythological battles between order and chaos, the dragon often wrestles with the tiger, the dragon being guidance from heaven, being an emissary of order, the tiger being an emissary of chaos. And why would you call him the Tiger of China? Well, tigers are mercurial, they hide, they're vicious, they often spring out of cover and kill people randomly. And that is a fair description of how Qin Shi Huangdi ruled. He was very mercurial. He never knew when you were going to get on his bad side. In fact, I have a supplemental resource for you to look at that has a little bit of a recreation of what Qin Shi Huangdi's life was like. Towards the end of his life, he became obsessed with immortality. And he sent emissaries out to different kingdoms, to different lands, even going as far away as India, as well as explorers out into the Western Sea looking for the so-called elixir of life. He was paranoid because there were several assassination attempts on him, and he wasn't exactly in the best frame of mind when he was older to begin with, so he becomes increasingly paranoid. Now, for example, he traveled through tunnels to get from one point to another, never letting himself being out in the open. He always traveled under covered walkways so somebody couldn't shoot him with a bow and arrow. So he was not exactly the most secure leader. In fact, he often consolidated all the decisions in his own hands and grew angry with people who tried to make executive decisions on his behalf. His sages at the time prescribed mercury for him to help not only calm him down, but to extend his life. And of course, we know what happens when people start drinking mercury. Well, giving a paranoid schizophrenic who's worried about assassinations, mercury is probably not the best idea, but at the time, it seemed like a good idea. Now, Qin Shi Huangdi was this dynamic ruler of China. He comes out of the Qin kingdom on the far western portion of China, and he becomes an absolutist monarch who is ruthless and absolutely ambitious. He unifies China through innovation and military might, and he embraces this competing philosophy to Confucianism, which is called legalism. Legalism, unlike Confucianism, is very utilitarian, very negative based, whereas Confucianism believes that people can be righteous, that they can be good, that they can have thoughtful actions. Legalism believes that people are base, disgusting animals who can't be trusted, and that you need to have harsh punishments in order to ensure that you have harmonious society. So it's not concerned with the betterment of humanity at all. It's worried about imposing order. Laws are completely inflexible, much in the same way that Hammurabi's code was. It was a very strict interpretation. There were very harsh punishments for violators. Most of the punishments resulted in death. When you've got millions of people living in your kingdom or in your empire, handing out death sentences seems like kind of an easy thing. Qin Shi Huangdi's innovations were enforced with legalism. He issued new currency, new universal writing, new universal weights and measures, and failure to obey is treason, and the punishment for treason is boiling in oil, or they bury you alive. Either one, kind of unpleasant. So you don't want to be caught using the old currencies, the old coins, the old weights and measures, or even, and this is the surprising thing, using Confucian books, reading Confucian manuals, or trying to record history. Anything that wasn't sanctioned by the government, by Qin Shi Huangdi's government, was considered treason. The book was burned, and of course the scholars who had the books would also be killed, usually in boiling oil or from live burial. So, order, yes. Harmonious, maybe. Benevolent, definitely not. The Qin state, though, does offer a firm set of rules, and it offers stability. It purges bandits and outlaws from its borders, and so peasants and farmers flock to it seeking safety, even though it is a tyrannical ruler with harsh laws. Military projects and weapons are rigorously tested under the Qin dynasty. You can have this kind of almost a respect for the way that they produced weapons. There was a standard template for all armors, for all weapons, for all bows, and then inspectors had to come in and stamp each one of the items with their personal signature. And if, for whatever reason, there was manufacturer defect, the person who inspected it, guess what? You get put to death. So inspectors ensured consistent design and high quality. Consistent design and high quality in the hands of a well-trained army means that technologically you are superior and you're going to be able to basically steamroll your enemies. The law governs everybody. Laws were written clearly and placed in public areas, and they reward the obedient and punish the schemers. The position of the ruler is what was important, not the ruler themselves. So being in the position of the emperor, I know it seems hard to separate the two, but being Qin Shi Huangdi, for instance, doesn't necessarily mean he's the emperor, but he does become the emperor. So the Qin dynasty begins to revamp what we can see as Chinese society. In fact, Qin, Qin, is pronounced Chin, gives its name to the area for all time. In fact, it becomes known as China. They set the template for later dynasties to follow. One of the things that they do is they introduce entrance exams for the bureaucracy. Now, why would you want people who are running the government to be well educated, to be literate, to be mathematically competent? Well, of course, it's so that everything runs smoothly and that they know their position within the government. You don't want somebody who can't count to be in charge of accounting. You don't want somebody who can't read to be in charge of contracts. Centralized authority with the emperor. The buck stops with the emperor. Now, in the case of the Qin dynasty, that was everything. All decisions stopped with the emperor. But you can see why. You would want one authority within a country that had, for hundreds of years, several different authorities. So if there's only one person that you can go to for the answer, that means that by deference, you're teaching people, by inference, you're teaching them to defer to the emperor. And then, of course, military projects took precedence because that was the way he got in power. That's the way he stayed in power. Now, one of the things, and there's an issue that I have with one of the additional resources that I posted, in that they erroneously say that the Great Wall was built at some later date, is that the Great Wall was actually started under Qin Shi Huangdi, although it wasn't terribly great. And in fact, we could argue that technically every dynasty built the Great Wall because it has different aspects, it has different lengths, it has different materials that are used in each one. So there are multiple smaller walls that exist before the Qin dynasty, and these are to protect typically the northern provinces from nomads. They are meant to be a barrier to slow them down, not to stop them. The Chinese never thought that the wall would stop them, but to more or less slow them down. During the construction of the Great Wall, the initial phase was to tamp down all this earth, to build up mounds of earth and then stamp on them. And by doing so, you create a very solid, near stone-like thickness. The problem, of course, is torrential downpours means that the walls would crumble. Over time, they erode. So later dynasties began to add bricks, and then stonework was added in the early modern period. Many of the workers were either peasants or criminals. Most likely criminals were used as a death sentence punishment, kind of worked to death. And indeed, there are archaeological evidence that people who died were buried in the foundations of the wall. They were just interred within the wall. So many people refer to the Great Wall of China as the world's longest cemetery. And work continues well after Qin Shi Huangdi's death. And here is the culmination of the Qin dynasty. Pretty extensive, and you can see that the Great Wall was already starting to come into place, although, again, I have issue with this particular map. It didn't extend quite that far, and it was definitely not contiguous. Now, another aspect of Chinese life that we want to stop and look at is this idea of the afterlife. Unlike Christian or Jewish or Muslim belief, there is no heavenly reward that guides the earth. The heavens are where the gods live, although there can be an afterlife for human beings. And this could be a good afterlife or a bad afterlife. And this is where ancestor worship comes into play. Now, ancient Chinese buried servants and animals to serve the kings in the afterlife. This gives us an idea that they believed that there was some kind of world after your death. By about 400 BCE, that practice of burying servants and animals with the kings had pretty much fallen into disuse, and instead there were clay stand-in dolls that were prevalent throughout tombs, and they performed different rituals. So you went in the afterlife with symbolic people and symbolic animals. The afterlife is a continuation and similar to mortal life. So you take everything with you. And the way that you continue to live in the afterlife, if it's a good afterlife, you have a lot of stuff with you and people remember you. If, however, you don't have things with you, and if people forget you, you are doomed to wander as a restless spirit, and you'll come back to the material world, haunt people, and this is where a lot of the ghost stories from China come from. Now, there's an ambitious pre-death project to ensure China's first emperor would not only have the appropriate position in afterlife, but that everybody would remember him. And that's the Terracotta Army that I mentioned before. This massive, absolutely gargantuan undertaking. 8,000 soldiers, strongmen, acrobats, musicians, bureaucrats, horses, and archers, including 320 chariots with attendant horses, 520 cavalry with attendant horses as well, and each were individually produced and life-size. They were different weights, different poses, different facial features, different weapons, armor, clothing, and stature. It was kind of a throwback to that older human sacrifice practice before about 400 BCE, in that people, or at least their likenesses, were very meticulously detailed. And I have a video in there that shows, in our additional resources, that shows just how meticulous this is, and I strongly recommend you watch that. So it's a revival of the older human sacrifice, but not really. These weren't actual people entombed within the tomb, but these were dolls or life-size mannequins that were modeled on actual people. So these 8,000 plus soldiers that they are still excavating is because of the were to be the eternal guards of the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi, the tiger of China and the first emperor of the Middle Kingdom. Eventually, all good things must come to an end, and in this case, all ruthless things must come to an end. Qin Shi Huangdi dies in 210 BCE. He dies while touring his empire, and his death is covered up for several days to prevent a collapse of the Qin dynasty. His son, Qin Shi, ascends to the throne in 210 BCE, but he is often considered a kind of puppet emperor, controlled by eunuchs and other palace intrigues. He wasn't nearly as capable as his father, wasn't nearly as charismatic or as forceful, and he begins to lose provinces to rebels and bandits. Eventually, Qin Shi is forced to commit suicide in 207 BCE, and the history goes on to complain that he was delusional and incompetent. And this history, it should be noted, was written by the successors of the Qin. That's where we get the first real codification of histories during the Han Dynasty. The Han are successors to the Qin Dynasty, and they have many parallels to the Roman Empire. They have an early period and a late period, for example, and they eventually abandon legalism. They keep it for the first few years, or for first few generations, but eventually Confucianism is adopted, and it is the Han Dynasty that really sets the bar for later dynasties. Now, Qin Shi Huangdi did all the hard work. He did all the heavy lifting. He unified the script. He unified the coins. But it was the Han Dynasty's longevity that allowed those changes to really take root in the Chinese people. Confucianism is readopted. Hidden troves of scrolls are returned to public use. And building upon the back of Qin's success, the Han begin to emphasize more stability. They emphasize building roads, infrastructure, ports, trading posts, and that sort of thing. They even begin to patronize schools and universities. In fact, the first university is founded in China in about the 2nd century BCE. And that is in order to turn out an educated and erudite bureaucracy. Here's the dynastic cycle, if we can kind of break it down into an easy pace. And we can use our friends, the Qin and the Han, as examples. Now, before the Qin dynasty, we had a period of chaos. And a strong leader emerged in the form of Qin Shi Huangdi. And he had what was called the mandate of heaven. The heavens smiled upon him. Why was he successful? Well, Confucians would say it was because he was acting rightly. He was bringing order to a chaotic world. But his dynasty was very short-lived, and there was a very, very tiny period of chaos and uncertainty when the Han dynasty takes over, the so-called Golden Age. They also have the mandate of heaven, and they even rise above the level of this dynamic leader. And they have a period in which everybody flourishes, but eventually there comes into the dynasties people who are inept, people who are corrupt, people who are insane, people who are just bad leaders, at least according to the mandate of heaven. And then this is the instigating point of the decline of the society. Now, it's far more likely that, yes, you had an incompetent leader who was unable to handle some of the crises that arose. And so, yes, maybe you could put it backwards and say it's because somebody was incompetent that these crises arose. But it's more likely that these crises arose and they were handled poorly. This leads to more crises breaking out. For instance, if you have a famine, and the response is sluggish, or maybe the response is inadequate, maybe you have peasant riots. If you have peasant riots, maybe you have civil war. If you have civil war, maybe more famine breaks out, and so on and so forth, until you reach a breaking point when the empire finally descends into a period of chaos. And that's exactly what we have at the end of the Han Dynasty. About the 3rd century of the current era, we get a breakup of the Han Dynasty into 3 separate kingdoms, the so-called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. While the societies were stable, particularly the Han Dynasty, while the Han Dynasty was stable, there were some amazing technological breakthroughs. Now, China has a lot of mountains, and mountains mean that there's tectonic plates underneath. And this would lead, of course, to earthquakes. Earthquakes are very devastating to farmers, infrastructure, and particularly to cities. And so a way to detect earthquakes was sought so that the empire could respond appropriately and quickly. They wanted an early notification, and hopefully they could predict earthquakes before they actually happened. This would allow for a quick response, which meant that they were acting in a moral and upright manner. Into this quandary comes the inventor Zhang Heng. He creates the world's first seismograph, and a replica is pictured here on the right. Inside of this big upturned bell is a vertical pole on a spring that has a weight at the top. As the earth shakes, if the earth shakes even just a little bit, that weight begins to rock back and forth. When it hits a switch inside, a ball is released from the dragon's mouth. The ball falls into the frog's mouth and making a characteristic ringing sound. That is the direction from which the earthquake came. The other balls are locked down as soon as one is released, so the others don't release and you have a false positive or you get confused. Well, the legend goes that for the longest time after installation, this device didn't register anything. And so the emperor thought that perhaps Zhang Heng was flim-flamming him, was scamming him. And the legend goes, and we have to take this with a huge grain of salt, that he was actually ordered to be executed, and that on the day of his execution, one of these balls dropped into the mouth of the frog. And so the emperor stays the execution. And they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and no reports of an earthquake comes in. So now it's back on to the execution. He's on the chopping block again, poor guy, nerve-wracked, when a rider runs up and reports that an earthquake happened in a village 3 days away in the very direction that the ball indicated. So now how much of that is true and how much of it is legend? Well, it's probably true that the emperor would be upset if it seemed like a false positive, or it seemed like the device wasn't working, and that was probably a death sentence. But was it actually last minute twice? Probably not. But it's a nice story, and it does spotlight some of the technological advancements that were possible because of the successful civilization that is China in the classic period. So I want to ask you to think about, why was the Qin dynasty not able to sustain itself for a very long time? What made the Han dynasty so stable by comparison? And then the transition from legalism to Confucianism was not overnight, but it did last through both the Han dynasties and beyond. What does this tell us about Confucianism and its application to Chinese society? All right, that's it. Don't forget to read Chapter 4, China's Classical Age, and read the sources as well. There's additional resources there for you to gain some perspective and learn by other means. Some of them can be a little silly, some of them can be a little bit of fun, some of them can be a little long, but do take the time to look through them. This is in lieu of you having other classes, so take the opportunity to learn by other means. If you have any questions about the material at all, please email me and I'll answer you as fast as I can. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoy the lecture, and I'll see you again next week.